Hey, warm and friendly hello! Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. We've got an excellent podcast for you. We're going to be joined in segment number 2 by one of our good friends, Blake Lovell. He does such great work over at Southeastern 16, taking a look at the SEC and really the entire landscape of college basketball. And we're going to chat with him about what we've all seen here in the offseason with these schools out there in the SEC, just a few teams in general that he's feeling a little bit bullish/bearish on as well, and so much more. Here in segment number 1, we did see a few splash moves in college basketball on Friday with a few guys that are very notable that are going to be returning, so we're going to be giving a little bit of a highlight to that as well. And then in the final segment, all the news and notes we saw in college basketball with regards to the newly landed transfers, we are going to be recapping those. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is by Twitter/X timeline at Jude_D1. Keep in mind, letters EM, they mean does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. The other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it's very much appreciated, and then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And I've not really been getting in any Twitter/X questions, so please do fire those in. And that said, I already recorded the final transfers, and we did see a few come through before I was able to record that, so I'll cover those right now before we get into the returning guys, because I do think that we should be really being able to highlight these guys that are returning. It's the old Shirley Donovan saying that sometimes the best kids are the ones that are already on your roster, but we did see Dylan Darling. He last season was over with the Red Storm of St. John's, averaging about 7 points, 2.5 assists per game, and Grand Canyon gets a good one here. And for Grand Canyon, they've been able to do a really nice job, in my opinion, in the transfer portal. When he was over at Idaho State 2 seasons ago, 5+ assists per contest, 13+ points per game. But now for Grand Canyon, all of a sudden they are spending the money. Obviously, Grand Canyon being a private university, they're able to do so. But Omaha Bailu, he was a former top 25 recruit. Jaden Zimmerman was solid over at Quinnipiac. You got Blake Barkley coming in from ETSU. Now you add in there Dylan Darling. That's very rock solid. And for Vanderbilt, we're going to be talking about this with our good friend Blake Lovell, because at the time they really hadn't signed anyone in the transfer portal, but that said, they are finally able to get up on the board as Berkey Betunzel. He was over at Nebraska this last season. Nice low post player for them. Not a guy that lit the world on fire, but 6.5 points, 5.5 boards. He's capable of popping some threes. He's a career 27% three-point shooter, but a steal and a block per contest. He decides that he's going to go to Vanderbilt. I don't know if that's necessarily the world's greatest fit for them, because Nebraska was a little bit of a slower tempo team this past season, but Vanderbilt, they do find a little bit of size. They certainly were going to need to replace that here in the offseason, and they're able to do so, so a little bit of an applaud there. But that said, in terms of the returning guys, we saw 2 big guys decide to return where they came. I was a little bit surprised by this one. Joshua Hubbard is going to be back at Mississippi State. Now, they need to put some pieces around him, because Hubbard has really been carrying the mail for the team the last few seasons, and he was really testing the NBA draft waters this last season. I mean, this past year, he put in there 22 points, a little bit over a steal, 3.5 assists, shot 34.7% from three-point range. Problem was Mississippi State, they were just absolutely miserable because they had absolutely nothing around him whatsoever. And you take a look at what they've done thus far this offseason. Mississippi State, their lone signing is R.J. Johnson, who was very solid over at Kennesaw State this last season, but they're going to need to add a little bit more. But the fact that they do bring back their top scorer from a season ago, who they so easily could have lost, I do applaud that move. And if you're going to be spending the big bucks, you probably do want to be retaining a guy like that, rather than just going out there and trying to be able to bring in some guy sight unseen, not knowing if he's going to be able to fit in the system. But hopefully this is not the end for them, and that they've got enough money to be able to add some ancillary pieces around him. And then Andrei Stojakovic, he's going to be returning to Illinois. They erased Stephen Fox in the transfer portal, and for Stojakovic, have to think that he's going to be better than the 24.4% three-point shooting that he had this last season when he was over at Cal and Stanford. Was more of like a 32% three-point shooter, so it's not necessarily the specialty of his game, but he was a big part of what Illinois did this last season. 13.5 points, 4.5 boards. Not a guy that's going to generate turnovers whatsoever. That just was not the Illinois style, but being able to maintain some camaraderie in the backcourt, being able to return a few guys, and Illinois has already returned a few of the other guys that we have seen here in the offseason. They've got a few more international men of mystery that have been on the roster for a few years that are going to be coming back as well. Being able to maintain much of that core, I think, is very important. And We've already seen a school like St. Louis be able to retain pretty much everyone except for Brady Dunlap. Purdue, they're going to be running back with everyone that has eligibility. They obviously lose Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer from that backcourt, but love these teams that they are sticking with their own, that they're trying to be able to re-sign their own guys. Maybe it causes for them to have a little bit less money to play with here in the transfer portal, but that said, I do love those moves. And what else I love is great chats with our friend Blake Lovell. He does such great work over at Southeastern 16. He joins me next right here on Gus with myself, Greg Peterson, now a part of the Decent Family Podcast. Inside Edge this college basketball season? Well, VSiN experts use CBB Analytics, the most comprehensive college basketball analytics platform in the world. See injury impact, on and off data, clutch time performance metrics, first versus second half splits, and so much more. Utilize the promo code of VSiN, that is VSIN, to get $30 off and find your betting edge over at cbbanalytics.com. That is cbbanalytics, all one word.com. For anyone that is new to VSiN, well, I wish you a friendly hello. This is an attention to anyone that is new to VSiN because you're able to get some free stuff with our daily newsletter. It's a great way to catch up on everything that's happening in the sports betting world. It's delivered straight to your inbox every single morning. VSiN's newsletter offers picks, data, strategies for the day's betting menu, and so much more. Sign up for free today over at VSiN.com/newsletter. That's VSIN.com/newsletter, and start receiving your free newsletter tomorrow morning. That is VSIN.com/newsletter. Stay ahead of the game and bet smarter with VSiN. And we're back here, lovely Las Vegas, for Gus with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And it's always a pleasure to be joined by this man, as we've got Blake Lovell aboard. He does such amazing work over at Southeastern 16, taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball, doing so all 12 months out of the year. Even though the SEC might not be hitting the floor for about 200 days, he's very locked in on all these offseason moves, what we've been seeing in terms of coaching changes, the fun transfer portal, and so much more. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X at the Blake Lovell. Last name is spelled Lovell all together. And Blake, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for always chatting me, Greg.
Thank you for joining me, Blake. And Blake, it has been a wild offseason thus far. We are only about a week and a half through, and when it comes to SEC notes, I think the biggest of them is, and we are recording this late on Thursday, so by the time this comes out, they might have signed like multiple guys already, but Kentucky, they get on the board with Zoom Diallo towards the middle of the week, but they've been relatively silent after being the biggest spenders in the offseason last year. How surprised by this have you been?
Yeah, I mean, as you've probably seen out there, Greg, there are some thoughts on that in terms of people actually using that against Kentucky this offseason to say, hey, this is a team that obviously spent a lot of money last year, and look what happened. It didn't really result in anything. And so you can now, again, use that against Mark Pope and company if you're an opposing program, just because it's sort of an easy layup to go out and say, well, this is what they're trying to do. But again, are they really putting together the kind of roster that's going to help you as a player or help you win more games? And so I think it is one that, you know, the way this has been trending so far for Kentucky, it's not been ideal. I think it's safe to say that. Of course, people were expecting Rob Wright to go there. He's back at BYU now. They did get Diallo, who I think was probably going to be their second choice in that group. It's certainly not a bad backup plan to have when it comes to bringing in someone from Washington, and I think will, again, be quite a star probably for this team, just based on his ability at point guard. But elsewhere, I don't really know what to expect with Kentucky when it comes to trying to figure out the rest of their roster. And I think, you know, as you start to look around and see teams, you know, like Tennessee, certainly Missouri, I think has gotten off to a pretty good start. Even South Carolina, Texas A&M, teams like that who seem to be building a little momentum. Texas, I would put in that group also. You know, Kentucky is still in full-on wait-and-see mode, and you're just not used to that at this point.
Yep, and I'm so glad that you mentioned Missouri because I have been very impressed by what we've seen out of them. They were able to make some nice moves on Thursday. As we know, they were able to do a nice job in terms of being able to hit the glass, unlike what they did in their first few seasons last year, and it feels like they're looking to build on this a little bit more, bringing in Bryson Tiller, bringing in Jalen Carey. How much do you feel like there might be a little bit of, shall we say, a change in the way that Dennis Gates operates? Because first few seasons at Missouri, team was lackluster on glass. It feels like they've made it a big priority to be much stronger down low.
Yeah, no question. And I mean, it's a Missouri team that we know always values size because of Dennis Gates coming from the Leonard Hamilton tree. We remember those Florida State teams, you know, they were continually ranked in the top 3 to 5 in just pure height nationally in college basketball. And that's kind of been the theme for Missouri. Like, they are certainly leaning in on the size here and the ability to, I think, win more games around the rim. And like you said, rebounding has certainly been an aspect the fans have been wanting them to improve for, again, several years now. And I think they've definitely made that a focus when you consider, like you said, they're bringing in Tiller, of course, Jalen Carey. You fully expect him, someone who is an SEC veteran at this point, having played for Vanderbilt and Tennessee. He's going to make an impact there. And then even, someone like Jameer Jones, who's 6'6", but a pretty good rebounder, around 5 rebounds a game or so there at Providence. So I think you feel pretty good if you're a Missouri fan in terms of the start here, because remember, you're going to have a situation where you've got Jason Crow, who's going to be, getting a lot of the attention just based on kind of what their expectations are for him. But when you really start to look at this roster, I think you have to feel pretty good about Missouri, at least addressing some of those issues. I'd still like to see them hopefully address some shooting. It'd be great, Greg, if they go out and find a Caleb Grill out there. I don't know if that's there for them, but they need someone who can be that knockdown three-point shooter, and I think that's the next thing they're probably searching for right now.
Yep, it certainly is going to be interesting to look at that, as Blake Lovell does such amazing work over at Southeastern 16. He's joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, and when it comes to what we've been seeing out of the SEC, I'm just really impressed by what Tennessee has been able to do as well, because typically Tennessee adds a guy or two. It really started up a few seasons ago with them realizing, hey, we need to be able to get that one go-to scorer. So they've been looking in the transfer portal to be able to find that go-to guy, and then it feels like they build everything else from within, and that really started up because you may remember the man that is playing for the Lakers, Dalton Connect, was really the guy that started that a few seasons ago. This offseason, they find that with Tyler Lundblade, but they've added much more than just Lundblade. They've added quite a few other ancillary guys. I know that over the last few days, they've really been adding to their collection with Miles Rubin coming in, Jalen Harrelson. What have you made out of this Tennessee offseason? Because they have made not just one splash move like they've done in the past, but now they've made, I would say, 4.
Yeah, and I think you could argue at the start, you were thinking Tennessee was the team that got hit the most in the transfer portal. When you start to see, J.P. Estrella going to Michigan, Bishop Boswell winds up at Maryland. Again, we just mentioned Jalen Carey's at Missouri. Amari Evans is still in the portal as of right now. Kate Phillips winds up at A&M. I mean, these are all significant players on this roster that once again got to the Elite Eight this past season. And so Troy Henderson decides to come back. Then you start to pair, like you mentioned, some of the things that Rick Barnes flat out said they were focusing on. Like he said, we have to be a better shooting team. And so they went out and got Tyler Lundblade, who's going to be able to do that. If that's all he can do on this Tennessee team, that's going to be fine, because they need someone like that that can just be that knockdown three-point shooter. And then you look at the combination of the other guys that they're bringing in, where you are going to have guys, I think, and someone even like a Jalen Harrelson at Notre Dame, who's going to really be able to impact the floor on both sides. And that's what, you have to be able to do if you're going to play for Rick Barnes in this Tennessee system. You've got to be a good defensive player, and I think that's where someone like him will fit the bill there. You look at Data Ames coming in from Cal, Miles Rubin obviously brings them some size. I still think we're going to see, again, what the overall front court looks like. I mean, Dwayne Brown, I think, will kind of evolve his game going into next season too. And so initially you're thinking Tennessee, again, may be the team that takes the biggest step back when you start to see all these pieces that are entering the transfer portal. And we've even mentioned it before. There were some discussions like, is Tennessee really going to have the resources from an NIL standpoint to be able to stay at the level they need to stay at? But I think they're starting to answer some of those questions, and they still need a few more pieces. And of course, they are chasing a specific point guard, I think, right now that could help them considerably and address even more of those shooting issues. But they're starting to get back on track after a couple of early hits there.
Yep, I think so as well. I think that things are starting to be able to get online for them, and been very impressed by what I've been seeing out of them, as Blake Lovell does such great work over at Southeastern 16, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And I'm so glad that in passing that you mentioned that South Carolina, it feels like they're stepping up their game a little bit, because for South Carolina, the last few off seasons, they haven't really done a whole heck of a lot. And I recognize that maybe it's not like earth-shattering or anything like that, but I mean, they've already added Camden Heide. He was over at Purdue last year at Texas, was a nice three-point shooter. Corey Mincy as well. How do you take a look at South Carolina right now? A team that has been at the basement of the SEC for much of the past decade plus, but even though right now it's still a little bit rough for them, they still need to add some more pieces. They're still behind the 8 ball when it comes to like recruiting, things like that. This feels like a nice step in the right direction.
Well, and that's the thing, is that I've always said, I think you could certainly make the argument that that is one of, even in some instances, maybe the toughest job in the SEC right now. I don't know exactly that South Carolina is able to spend at the level that a lot of these other programs are. And I think that's the challenge that Lamont Paris is facing. Do I expect them to replicate the season of a couple of years ago? They're in the February and they're competing for the SEC title after being picked last and all that. I don't. That's going to be a long way to get there, because I just don't think, again, they're going to spend the amount of money they necessarily need to, but you can see, bringing in a Cam Heide from Texas. We were looking at Texas, after they added two guys in David Punch and Isaiah Johnson, we're like, okay, Texas with Cam Heide coming back and like all these other guys. And of course, he decides to transfer to South Carolina, where I think he'll be able to make more of an impact because, again, that Texas roster, I think, is starting to get pretty crowded with what should be, I think, one of the premier teams in the SEC next season. And you look at the way that roster is coming together. But you mentioned even a Corey Mincy, someone like that. South Carolina lost a lot of guys in the transfer portal, but I don't know that that is necessarily a bad thing because, last year's roster just did not come together the way they needed it to. A long way to go, as you said, for them to be able to, I think, be competitive in the SEC and compete in the top half. But unfortunately, it is all about the money. And I'm curious to see how much of that South Carolina has at its disposal as they continue to try to navigate this very tough, NIL and SEC landscape right now.
Yep, it certainly is, and we're going to see what they're going to be able to do moving forward because I'm very intrigued to see if they're going to be able to add on this. It's a good start, but certainly at this point, it's only a start for them, so we'll see if they're going to be able to add a few more pieces. And then this team, I think, is very interesting in terms of the fact that they have not done much of anything whatsoever. That'd be Georgia. I mean, they add one nice piece, Freddie De Leon. He was a nice double-figure scorer over at Penn State, but we both know that Penn State had themselves a rough season. Is this one team that's on your radar in terms of them trying to be able to come alive a little bit more here in the next few days and are hoping that perhaps the price point is dropping on a few of these guys?
Yeah, this is another one where I think the outside perception of the job, I think, is different than just maybe what it actually is right now. And again, I don't know what that number is for Georgia. I know they were pretty competitive last year in terms of their NIL, but what happened? I mean, they kind of exceeded expectations in a way. And what does that do? Well, that attracts attention to some of your best players. And so Jeremiah Wilkinson now decides to go to Arkansas, where I'm sure he's getting paid more. Santos Surreal decides to go to Miami, where he's probably getting paid more. And so you keep going down the list of some of those guys that they've lost on this roster. And like you said, they do pick up Freddie De Leon from Penn State, of course, who was at Tennessee and showed a lot of, I think, potential in that first year when he was with the Vols. So at least there's something, you can lean on there kind of as a start. If you're Mike White and looking at a guy at the guard position who can be able to kind of maybe lead the way a little bit. But yeah, there's still a lot to try to figure out, I think, with Georgia right now. Even if, again, you are expecting some of those key returners are going to be back. I think that's something to certainly keep an eye on with, kind of a main core of players with those guys catching and Smurf and all those guys. So I think it is maybe one where you're looking at Georgia and feeling like retention is a big important piece given the number of guys they've lost. I just, again, Greg, it's like I don't know that we're going to be looking at Georgia as probably anything more than like a potential sleeper type team again, because I just don't know that they're going to put together a roster that all of a sudden is going to jump, 7, 8, 9 other teams in the SEC, especially given how we've already talked about some of these teams that are either bringing in key guys or you have a situation like Florida where all of a sudden they may decide just to run this thing back and, potentially be the number 2 preseason team in the country next year.
Yep, and with Florida, the only guy that they're bringing right now is Denzel Aberdeen. He needs to get a waiver to be able to play. I think that that's a very interesting situation, to say the least, but certainly they're going to be returning quite a bit of that size as well, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that as well. How much do you value these teams that are just going to be able to run it back? Like we saw with St. Louis, you mentioned Florida bringing back quite a few guys as well. Obviously, Florida, a few losses from last season as well, but while there's so many teams like Louisville that are spending big money out there in the transfer portal, I think Tennessee in the SEC, very, very good case of this as well. These teams that are bringing back their guys, they might not be capturing the headlines, but at the same time, I do think that's one of the most powerful things a team can do in the offseason.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to, what's going on in the Big Ten, because let's call it what it is. Like, I think some of these Big Ten teams, we saw it last year, we see it this year, and it's not even just the Big Ten, right? It's the Louisvilles in the ACC. It's some of the top Big East teams. Like, they're able to outspend for some of these players. And I think that's where, if you're finding ways to keep your guys who helped you be successful in some ways last year, that is as important as anything. Because, and you've seen the numbers, Greg. Like, you can look out there with Evan Mia and everybody else who kind of tracks the sort of NIL, numbers right now, and they are just simply astronomical. And the amount of increase from last year to this year is absurd in many ways. We mentioned this was going to be kind of the offseason of the big man. But it's not just that. Like, guards are getting paid more too. Like, it ain't just the big man. And so I think that's where, if you're able to bring back some key pieces, that's going to go a long way for some of these teams. And so, like we mentioned, you've got some teams like maybe even a Georgia can lean on some of that. Of course, Florida's going to be the team that leans on it the most. We'll see how many guys Alabama gets back. Auburn's already had several key guys kind of announced their return. Of course, you can say the same about Arkansas. The difference in one or two of those guys coming back could be, the difference in them being a preseason SEC title favorite right up there with Florida. So I think that's what we're really, waiting to see. And that's where, as we kind of said to start this conversation, teams like Kentucky, if you're a team like LSU, who is completely going to have to overhaul your entire roster with a new coaching staff in year one, these are things that you're really kind of trying to battle against. And even Vanderbilt, I would throw into that mix, right? We still got a big decision out there with Tyler Tanner, but they were an old team last year. And so there's not a lot of guys coming back on that roster outside of maybe Chandler Bing and Jaden Leverett who are going to be able to make key contributions probably because they have, a lot of guys coming in on the freshman class. So yeah, that could be what separates these teams as we head into next season.
Yep, it certainly could be, and I'm very intrigued to see what we're going to be able to get moving forward out of the transfer portal. And I want to just open it up a little bit more here because we've kept it SEC-centric and very rightfully so. But as we know, it's portal madness out there. We've got so many guys that are changing teams that it's not even funny. And just is there a team or two that might be outside the SEC that has really caught your attention with what they've done here in the offseason? Could be good, bad, or indifferent, but just a team or two that you identify and you just think, wow, they're really making moves.
I did mention earlier, I think I was curious, and we always have had our fascination, Greg, with Buzz Williams, and when he was at Texas A&M, and now at Maryland. Of course, year one did not go so well, but, again, when I see him adding someone like a Bishop Boswell to the mix, and I start to see some of these guys that maybe are kind of fitting into what they want to do, I'm at least intrigued to see if he can find that success in the Big Ten and see how it comes together. Certainly I think that's one. You also, of course, have to look at two teams in particular, I think, that maybe have stood out near the top, and that's Indiana and Louisville, right? I mean, we're talking about teams that are chasing that past glory and really trying to put together rosters that are going to make them be those top 5, top 10 teams. And so when you look at, of course, the numbers, just the absolute, again, just pure numbers, like of how many guys Indiana has already added to the mix, whether it's Marcus Burton, whether it's Yuka Tolu, Aiden Sherrill, and so forth. This is a roster that is really starting to come together. Say if you're a Hoosier fan, as we said, you look at an ACC team in Louisville where we've seen this league be a bit up and down. Of course, you've got some turnover from a coaching standpoint, but, for Pat Kelsey to already lock down Flory Badunga and Jackson Shelstad, which, pretty much a package deal there, and then grab Carter Knox, who we know has a lot of upside, even though the injuries kind of played a role at Arkansas. I mean, those are two teams that, again, feel like they're at least about to turn that corner and be back into sort of perennial favorites. So I would say some of those, teams like that, certainly a lot of focus on the Big Ten just based on, the recent success they've had and just what they're putting into this from an NIL standpoint. But it is also fascinating to see teams like Louisville, even in Miami, right? We mentioned Santos Surreal going there earlier. These are teams that you can tell are putting a lot into this right now and are able to kind of spend up a little bit to make sure that their program is about to try to hit a different level. And so, yeah, those are the ones that I think have been pretty fascinating.
Yep, I totally agree with you on Indiana. They've been making some great moves. I love what I've seen out of them. Obviously, one of the big headliners has been Louisville. There's a lot of teams that are putting a lot into this, and we are about only a week and a half into Portal Mania. I know that you, Blake, are doing a great job keeping your finger on the pulse of all of it. There's no one man that's able to track all of this, but you're doing a great job of looking at everything on the SEC side of things and so much more. So let the good people at home know what's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, always appreciate it, Greg. Yeah, you can find all our SEC stuff over at Southeastern 16 on YouTube. Of course, we're tracking the daily SEC basketball transfers, giving our thoughts on all these guys that are entering the conference. So, yeah, you can find all of our videos over there. And everything else college basketball, you can follow me on Twitter/X at the Blake Lovell.
And Blake doing such a great job looking at this wonderful sport of college basketball. Big thanks to him for joining me on Cuss Cove Soups, now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. And up next, it is that time of the podcast to give you a roundup of the transfer news and notes that you saw over the last 24 hours. Back here, lovely Las Vegas, for Cuss Cove Soups with myself, Greg Hoops Peters, and now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. Always a pleasure to be joined by Blake Lovell. He does such amazing work over at Southeastern 16, looking at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. every single time he joins me. He lends such great insights and did so once again today. So big thanks to Blake for joining me in the last segment. Now it is that time of the podcast. I gave a recap of the news and notes that we saw in college basketball over the last 24 hours. Alabama lands Cole Kohler. Hopefully I got that correct. He was a guy that was from the great state of Florida, was pretty much in the recruiting class of 2026 and never really played for NC State, but he has decided that he's going to be flipping to Alabama. 6'7" guy that should really fit the system. Does a nice job popping it from three. He's a guy that can dribble a little bit as well. He's not going to be like a primary point forward or anything like that, but that said, I do think that there's quite a bit of upside there. Do like the pickup for them. And then speaking of Alabama, how about if we go with Alabama State? They're on the board with a transfer as well. Isaiah Barnger, hopefully I got that correct. He was playing over at Texas State this last season, and over at Texas State, didn't necessarily see a lot of playing time this last year. Saw a little bit more when he was over at UT Rio Grande Valley over the last few years, but still is a guy that at 6'7" is able to pop it a little bit from three, has always been a relatively reliable rebounder, has just dealt with injury over the last few seasons, so they land a nice ad for a school like Alabama State, just being able to get up there on the board, being able to get a transfer to be able to go down and have something to build around. That is going to be able to help them out moving forward. And hey, Wisconsin's on the board as Trey Autry. He last season was playing over at George Washington for our nation's first president, was averaging about 11 points per game, shot 38.5% from three-point range, was a full-time starter this last season. He lands with Wisconsin. He very much fits the system of Wisconsin. Do I think that he's going to be like some sort of a game breaker guy or anything like that? No. If Wisconsin's looking to build around Trey Autry, their backcourt, then they're probably in a rough situation because they lose the likes of John Blackwell and company from a season ago. But if they're looking at him being an ancillary piece, that's a good place to start. And then you've got Jamari Huguet. He was over at Marshall this last season and as a 6'6" combo player, really shot it well from three, 41.5% from three, 4.5 points, 2.5 rebounds per game. He has decided that he is going to be going on over to Austin Peay. It is a Marshall team that lacked a little bit in terms of generating turnovers, and that's been a forte of Austin Peay, so they're going to need to work on that. But with the fact that Tate McCubbin is now off the board, they lose him in the offseason. They needed to be able to really be able to fill that void. I do think that they did a really good job in terms of being able to do so. So I think that this is going to be a rock solid pickup for them. And even though he might not be necessarily the world's greatest fit for them, I do think that he's a guy that's going to be able to find a role. And I just trust in that Gibson system in general to be able to do a great job in terms of being able to get the best out of him. And then speaking of Tate McCubbin, he decided that he is going to be heading on over to Northern Iowa. For McCubbin last season, he was very rock solid over at Austin Peay, 9.5 points, 4.8 boards at 6'8", shot about 34.5% from three-point range. He's a guy with good versatility. He has some active hands, being able to generate about 1.3, 1.4 steals per game. He just fits the Northern Iowa system in general. Obviously, they lose Ben Jacobson in the offseason, but I do think that with the way that this current regime is set up, I do think that Northern Iowa is still going to be trying to stick with their roots. I do think that they're still going to be trying to play that tough, tenacious style basketball. I don't know if they're going to be quite going as slow as they have in the past few seasons, but still, I do think that with the passing of the torch, this is still going to be a team that they try to stay very, very true to themselves under Kyle Green, a guy that spent a lot of time in the program before he ended up landing at Iowa State the last few seasons. So do think that that's a good pickup for them. For Youngstown State, the Penguins waddled their way onto the board. They already picked up Jeff Nowako, who was a 6'6" combo player over at Oklahoma. Now they pick up a guy that had some good production last year, albeit it was at a lower level for VMI. Linus Holmstrom, he last season gave that team 11.5 points, did shoot 39.4% from three-point range, and for Youngstown State, they're probably going to need to instill a little bit of defense into him. VMI, never really a great defensive team, but he's certainly a guy that's going to be able to knock down some threes. I think that he's going to be able to fit relatively well in the system. He's able to guard multiple positions, so I do think that this is a solid pickup for them. That's really going to be able to help them out along the outside as well, so I do like what they're going to be doing there, and I like what Western Michigan is doing as well. They're bringing in quite a bit from UT Rio Grande Valley because they do bring in UT Rio Grande Valley's coach from a season ago, and Khalil Fennell. He's already brought with him a few of his guys. Now they bring in Augustinus Clodulis, who he was able to really tear it up, ironically enough, at VMI 2 seasons ago. For VMI, was putting in there about 15 points, 6.5 boards, wasn't a great three-point shooter. Spent this year at Colorado State as more of an ancillary piece where he was shooting about 41.5% from three, 6 points per contest at 6'8". He's got the ability to be able to stretch the floor with Julian Gomez and Jalen Washington coming over from Grand Valley. I do think that they've got a nice little bit of a fulcrum set up, so I like what is happening here. Obviously, they're going to probably need to add a few more pieces, but Western Michigan out there in the back, they look like they're on the up and up. Western Kentucky, they're on the up and up up with bringing in Sharon Young. He last season was playing over at Akron. Wasn't like a game breaker for them or anything like that, but a nice, shall we say, ancillary guy. 7.5 points per contest. He 2 seasons ago shot 40% from 3. That was down to 33% this past season, but was able to generate ACO per game. He's used to a very up-tempo style with playing over at Akron the last 2 seasons. I think that this is a good fit with their system. I think that he's going to be able to fit in right away, be able to give this team some nice upside, so I do like what they're bringing in there. For Vermont, they are finally up on the board with a transfer, Dale Yepto. He last season was playing over at UMass Lowell, so they're bringing in someone from within the conference, and for Yepto, it was a little bit of a slow start to the season for him, was able to close out relatively strong, 10.5 points per contest, shot 36.5% from 3-point range. In conference play, you did see a little bit of a dip with regards to that 3-point shooting percentage, but a guy that should be able to really fit this system. He is a part of a UMass Lowell team that was able to do a nice job on the defensive glass at home last season as well. He is going to be a guy that's probably not going to generate like a lot of turnovers or anything like that, but having familiarity with the conference, being a relatively good 3-point shooter, that's what this team is very much looking for. So I do think that this is going to be able to help them out quite a bit moving forward, and I think that this is going to be a nice helpful add as well, as you did see Nichols finally be able to get up on the board. A.J. Dent Jr., he was playing over at Tarleton State this past season, and for Tarleton State, they were a bit of a mash unit this past season, but he's going to be coming in. When he was out there on the floor, it was a very limited sample size. He was averaging about 6 points per game. It looked like he was going to see some great minutes. He had his season ended after just 2 games. At 6'5", he's able to do a nice job with his active hands. Tarleton State, one of the best teams in the country in terms of generating turnovers. Nichols is always a team that prides themselves on being able to generate turnovers as well, so the fit is there. Obviously, he needs to be healthy, but if so, I think that that's going to be a good add for them. Tate Blackshear, he last season was over at Youngstown State, was averaging about 7 points per game, left something to be desired on the glass. At 6'6", he averaged 1.6 rebounds per game, but he heads on over to Niagara. He should be a nice fit with that system for Niagara. They're going to need to get a little bit more size and a little bit more rebounding. They got completely destroyed on that end of things last season, but I mean, this is a upgrade for a Niagara team that they just had nothing return last season. This is going to be a nice starting spot for them, so I like this pickup, and I like this one for Nebraska. Trayvon Leonard, he last season was over at Utah Valley, was a do-it-all guy for them. 12 points, 6 assists, 5.5 rebounds per game, shot 37% from 3. It was a Utah Valley team that was a top 25 team in terms of points allowed on a per possession basis. With Nebraska, they should be able to help clean up some of the turnover issues that he had, because Utah Valley, the one real kryptonite that they had was that they just weren't taking care of the ball. I think that this is a really good fit for them, and I do think that there's a lot of upside moving forward with this one, so I really applaud this move, and I do think that this is one that is very much going to be working out. Abdou Yarmo was a little bit of a 6'6" redshirt over at South Carolina this last season, and he has decided that he is going to be heading on over to Longwood. For Longwood, they've done a nice job in terms of finding some of these diamond in the rough sort of guys, and I think that this could be another one of them. When he was coming out in high school, he was having a little bit of fanfare. I'm not going to say that he was like a top 20 guy or anything like that, but out there in the Virginias, he was like a top 20 prospect within the state, has a little bit of versatility for him. For Longwood, they were a really rough 3-point shooting team. He should be able to help out a little bit with that regard, so I do like the pickup for them. And then you got Okazu Amalaife. He was last season over at Lamar. He's decided that he's going to be going to Louisiana Tech. He was a little bit of a redshirt last season at 6'7", is not going to be like popping it from 3-point range, doesn't have a lot of versatility, but he's a guy that does a great job with just his overall low post play, being able to hit the boards. That's what this team, in my opinion, is all about. Now, they're going to need to get a little bit more 3-point shooting than they had last year, because last year they had, well, absolutely no 3-point shooting whatsoever, so that was a little bit of an issue, but still, I do think that this is going to be a nice system fit for them, and I think that he's going to be able to come in there, have some success. For Kansas, they are finally on the board with the transfer. Keno Dawes, he was last year over at Utah, a Utah team that was rough, but he was able to be a rock-solid player for them. He was like the lone guy grabbing boards for them at 6'9", about 12.5 points, 8.8 boards, 2.2 assists per game. He very much fits the defensive style for Kansas. Now, for Kansas, they're going to need to find a little bit more scoring. Keno Dawes, not a guy that's really going to be stretching the floor, popped a few threes from 3-point range. He was shooting about 32% from 3, so that's not very reliable, to say the least, but at the same time, he does have a little bit of versatility to his game, but overall, I do think that this is a good starting spot for them. If Kansas is done in the transfer portal, well, they're going to have left a lot to be desired. That said, if this is just a starting point and they're going to be adding a little bit more, I think that you could feel relatively good about that, and I feel like you can feel relatively good about getting Moore, Justin Moore. He heads on over to Hofstra. Hofstra, as we know, they lose Cruz Davis, but they've had themselves a nice offseason. Tanner Thomas, he 2 seasons ago absolutely tore it up at Sacred Heart. Emmanuel Zukaloff is a true 7-footer that's able to shot block. Now you bring in a guy in Justin Moore who he's maybe not a guy that's going to be a lightning rod on offense with his scoring, but is able to do a nice job in terms of doling it out. You go back 2 years ago to what he did over at Loyola Chicago before things just toilet bowled on that program last year, and he was averaging 7.5 points, 5.3 assists per game, albeit it was in a small sample size, and again, he's only been a career about 28% three-point shooter, but this is a guy that's able to dole it out, was a 2-year starter over at Drexel as well, so I do think that this is going to be a really good ad for them, and I really applaud what they've been able to do in the transfer portal thus far. It feels like they're putting together a pretty rock-solid offseason, and it feels like these guys are putting together a pretty rock-solid offseason. How about George Washington? They already got Terrence Arsenault. They're going to be bringing in now also Felix Carrasas. He was over at Colorado, and Amari Weatherspoon. Weatherspoon is by far the bigger get here, as you're bringing in a guy that was very good in the ACC this last season at 6'4", 7.5 points, 3 boards, 2.5 assists from 3-point range, popped it at a clip of only about 29%. That waned on him towards the back half of the season, but a combined 30 points in the last 2 games of the season. He was the guy that they were willing to trust in as a freshman. When you're putting up those numbers as a freshman out there in the ACC, that's big. George Washington, they are losing quite a few guys like Garrett Johnson and Trey Autry and company from a season ago, but I mean, that's a good place to be able to start for Carrasas last season over at Colorado. 4.5 points per game, did shoot 38% from 3 at 6'5", really is a little bit of a one-trick pony in terms of shooting threes and not doing a whole heck lot else, but that is a really good one trick, so I do think that that's going to be solid for them. And then in terms of the other George out there in the Atlantic 10, they have been able to be very active here over the last few days. They've got Efosa Olaji Elabor, hopefully I got that correct, coming in for Butler. Ahmed Ayadir, he committed a few days ago from Loyola, Maryland, and then Michael Marcus, he comes over from Appalachian State. Now they get in Baraka Okoji along with William Marvel, so they're going to be going to the SoCon ranks for these. For Marvel, he last season shot 52.2% from 3-point range, 9.5 points, 2.3 assists per game. Defense lackadaisical to say the least. He's going to need to work on that, but if they need some 3-point shooting, they certainly got that in them for Okoji. He's a guy that's able to be a nice, shall we say, go-to facilitator, and he's back at George Mason. Actually began his career at George Mason when he was there during the 2023-24 campaign. He was solid. Like, as a freshman, he put in there 8 points, 2.5 assists, 1.5 steals per contest, became more of a mean ball handler this last year over at Mercer, 5.3 assists, 19.5 points per game, shot about 32.5% from 3. Career average is about 31.6% from 3, so maybe not like just a super hot 3-point shooter, anything like that, but he's able to be a functional 3-point shooter. Him being able to dole out the ball for the team, I think is going to be massive for them, and I do think that that's a great get. Speaking of Colorado transfers, by the way, Florian Atlantic was able to get one on the board as well, and Florian Atlantic has been very active these last few days. Afala Fawazi, hopefully I got that correct. He was over at Colorado this last season. He's a true 7-footer that comes over from Nigeria. He was averaging 2 rebounds per game, less than a point per contest. He's going to be a little bit of project player here for Florian Atlantic. They already addressed scoring with bringing in Jelani Hamilton, an 18-plus point per game guy over at Georgia State. Braden Speed was solid over at Loyola, Maryland. Josh Harris is a little bit of an upside guy that they bring in from Indiana. Now they're going to be going with Fawazi, so I do think that they've done a very good job in terms of mixing and matching here in the offseason, and I really do like this pickup for them. And then I like this pickup for Dayton. This is a guy that was a little bit out of sight, out of mind this last season, Jalen Hayes. He was completely injured last season. That's why you don't know a whole heck of a lot about him. But for Jalen Haynes, when he was out there on the floor 2 years ago, going back to his time with George Mason, 14 points, 6.9 rebounds per game. Now, the one issue with him is that he has missed 2 out of the last 3 seasons due to injury. So that's a little bit of a problem. But if they're able to get him fully healthy, he's not a guy that's going to go out there popping and locking from 3-point range or anything like that. But a Dayton team that year in and year out, they've had some struggles on the glass. He could be a really nice rim protector for them. He's a guy that's able to play in a little bit more of an up-tempo style as well if needed. So I do think that they have been able to do a very solid job in terms of being able to land a little bit of talent, and I think that this is going to be able to help them out for Cincinnati. They've done a tremendous job in terms of being able to add in their talent. They've got Elamine, hopefully I got that correct. He's going to be following Jared Calhoun on over from Utah State, guy that really didn't see a lot of minutes last season. This is more of a project guy, so I mean that's not really exciting, but they already brought in a Riley Allen patch, Miles Colvin, who was over at Purdue and Wake Forest, and now they add Eric Mahaffey, one of the Mahaffey brothers from Akron. Do I think that he's going to be like a complete game breaker for the team? No, but last season over at Akron, he was able to put in there about 8 points, 5.5 rebounds per game. He is a man that is from Cincinnati, Ohio, shot 39% from three-point range. If they're looking for some like microwave scoring off the bench or something like that, they certainly have found it here, and I think that is very much what they are going for, so that's a good solid add, and that's just a nice way to be able to add a little bit of depth in general for this team, and you do like to see some of these teams adding a little bit of depth, because we've seen a lot of teams be able to go with some bigger players and be able to get the just giant stakes off the board. Now you need to be able to add a little bit more with regards to being able to accent that steak. You need to be able to add the garnishes. You need to be able to add that steak sauce to be able to help you out, for lack of a better term, and they've been able to do that thus far. So Cincinnati, very active in the transfer portal, very much looks like they're going to be going for it, and I do applaud their efforts there. And then I like this ad for Oklahoma. They've been a little bit silent here in the transfer portal, but that in there a guy that I think is going to be able to fit the system really well. Tyler Hendricks, he has familiarity with the conference because he was over at Central Florida a few seasons ago. This last year over at Utah Valley, he was their main three-point shooter. 44.8% three-point shooter, about 12 points, pair of assists, 4.5 boards. Utah Valley was a really good defensive team, and Oklahoma last year was not. At 6'5", he's going to be able to give them a nice option to be able to pop it and lock it from three-point range. I do think that there's a lot of upside with him, and I think that this is going to be a really good ad for them moving forward. I like what they're doing there. And all of a sudden, Pepperdine is getting on the board with some nice ads. Peter Mistrovich, he comes over from Long Beach State as a double-figure scorer. Anthony Robinson didn't see great minutes, but a 6'10" big man that comes on over from Xavier. And now they add in their Evan Haywood. He was over at Butler this last season. It's not like he was lighting the world on fire over at Butler or anything like that, but still, a guy that was averaging 7 points per game, shot 36% from three-point range. It was a Pepperdine team that they were absolutely anemic on offense last season. They weren't necessarily that great on defense either, so they needed a little bit of everything. They've been able to do a really good job here in the transfer portal. I don't know if they're going to be towards the top of the WCC, even with Gonzaga being out of the fold, but it's very clear that they're taking some steps in the right direction. You do like to see that, so that's very rock solid for them, and I like this ad for Robert Morris. They're now up on the board with an ace in the hole. Ace Valentine, he last season was over at UMBC. He was their main facilitator, as for UMBC, he doled out about 4 assists, 4 rebounds per game, 12 points per game, and he shot 38% from three-point range. For Robert Morris, they're going to need a little bit more, but I mean, the one issue that they had last season was that they turned the ball over a little bit too much. This is very much going to be able to help to address that, so I like what they're going to be able to bring there, and I do think that this is very much addressing a need for them. Now we'll see what they're going to be able to do moving forward, since they do lose a lot of that fulcrum from a season ago. Ty Bevins, he last season was over at George Washington, very much an ancillary guy. Now he is a career 35% three-point shooter. In the small sample size of 10 games that he played last year, shot below 30% from three, but he has decided that he's going to Ryder. Ryder just needs anything to go right whatsoever. It has been very, very brutal for them over the last few seasons. Like, let's call it what it is. This has been not good, to say the least. So, adding a guy like this, it doesn't sound significant, but it's a step in the right direction for Ryder. They just need to be able to get anything whatsoever to go right for them, and I feel like this is something that went right. So, a yay verily to them. UTEP has been very active here over the last few days. Augusto Casa coming over from Ole Miss along with Reese Miller from William & Mary are nice moves, and now they had in there Reed Kaysen. He last season was over at East Carolina. He was putting in there about 4 points, 3.5 rebounds per game. At 6'10", he's a little bit of a project big man, and I think for UTEP, just year in and year out, getting absolutely destroyed on the glass, they've realized that they need to go with a little bit more size. We might be seeing a little bit of, shall we say, a philosophy change with them, and if so, this is probably going to be a nice way to be able to start that up. Not a guy that's going to give you versatility and pop it from three, but I do think that he can be able to address a nice need for them. James Evans last year was over at CSUN. He was averaging a respectable about 6 points, shot 33% from three. Needs to work on the sub 70% free throw shooting. As a matter of fact, sub 60% free throw shooting, but was a part-time starter for them last season. He's heading it over to UC Riverside. For UC Riverside, it was a relatively rough year, number one, under Gus Argino. It was clear that he just didn't have his guys in there. Now they had in there Dallas Washington, who was over at Long Beach State, Devin Malcolm, who was over at Cal Baptist, and now this gentleman and James Evans from CSUN. So they're very much going with the California pipeline right now, but I do think that these moves are very rock solid for them, and I do think that they're doing a solid job in terms of making themselves more competitive for this upcoming season. How about Toledo adding Sean Jones? He last season was playing over at Marquette. For Marquette, he was very limited. He only saw 8 games. He was averaging about 6.5 points per game. You go back to his last full season, because he's dealt with injuries over the last few seasons. He played 16 games during the 2023-24 campaign, so again, was cut short due to injury, but he was averaging about 6 points, pair of assists per contest. There was a lot of upside thinking that he could be a primary facilitator for the team, just had that cut short. But for Toledo, if he's able to be healthy, and that's a big giant if, because that's the one thing that has really been holding him back, I think that they might be looking at something great here. So that's a good add for them, and we'll see if that's going to be able to pan out for Toledo. Obviously a little bit of a roll of the dice, but if they're able to keep him healthy, I think that they got themselves a really nice add here. For South Florida, they just keep adding guys themselves, adding in their Zayden Hive from UNC was rock solid, Garrett Johnson, Sonny Wilson, and now they add in there AJ Dantzler. He last season was playing over at Coastal Carolina, and he was really good for Coastal Carolina. 15.5 points, shot 39.5% from 3, 5.5 boards, pair of assists per game. Guy that's not afraid to get his nose dirty. He's not the biggest guy at 6'2", but for Chris Mack, he has done a great job here in the transfer portal. You got a high-octane team. I believe that they are really going to be pushing tempo. The issues that he had over at Charleston last season with the three-point shooting, I think that he's done a great job in terms of alleviating those for his, shall we say, fresh start here with South Florida. So absolutely love that. And for St. Joe's, they're looking to not be average Joe's, as they're on the board with a pair of transfers, as Gavin Mars, he last season was over at Oregon State. He was just a guy that was 7 feet tall through his 2 seasons over at Oregon State. He only averaged like a half a point per contest, so this is a little bit more of a project guy. They're hoping for a little bit of upside there, but then they bring in Logan Carey. He last season was over at Maine. Maine played some great defense. They were absolutely awful on offense, but he did shoot 35% from 3. 9.5 points, 2.5 assists per game. It's a big step up going from the America East on over to St. Joe's, so they're going to need to add a little bit more if they're banking on Logan Carey being able to carry the offense. Well, they're probably in for a little bit of a rude awakening. If this is a little bit of a death piece, a little bit of a guy that they're going to be able to develop for multiple years, then I do like that move. And what I love is just coming at you guys every single day on this podcast. If you do like what you're hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have 1 or 2 ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters CM, they mean does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it's very much appreciated, and then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And a big thanks once again to our guy, Blake Lovell, who does such great work over at Southeastern 16, for joining me in the last segment, coming at you guys every single day on this podcast here in the offseason, looking at all the transfer moves and what we're going to be getting for the upcoming season. And then once we get in season, picks and analysis on every single game, every single day. So appreciate you tuning in today. I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.